This is The Big Three from the Coalition for a Prosperous America with senior economists Mihir Torsakar and Andrew Reschenberg.
How did a small fishing town of about 60,000 people on Peru's coast become a key piece in the U.S.-China rivalry? In November 2024, Xi Jinping inaugurated the port of Chancay, a Chinese state-owned megaport built and operated by COSCO, and the first port in the Western Hemisphere that Beijing controls end-to-end. Chancay is the most visible piece of a network, 37 Chinese port projects across Latin America and the Caribbean, plus the cranes, plus the scanners and rail corridors connecting them. Today on The Big Three, we're going inside that network and what it means for U.S. supply chains, shipbuilding, and national security with the analyst who built the database that maps it. Welcome to The Big Three from the Coalition for a Prosperous America, where each week we break down the three biggest stories shaping U.S. trade, industrial policy, and the American economy. I'm Mihir Torsakar alongside my fellow senior economist Andrew Reschenberg. So let's get to it. So today we're joined by Henry Ziemer, Associate Fellow with the Americas Program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Henry testified in March before the U.S.-China Economic and Security Review Commission on China's expanding interests in Latin America, and his central argument was that Chinese firms in the Western Hemisphere have built a coordinated network of influence that runs across ports, terminals, cranes, scanners, rail corridors, energy infrastructure, and digital systems. This is a U.S. economic security story playing out in our own hemisphere along trade routes that connect directly to U.S. supply chains, U.S. manufacturers, and U.S. military operations. So, Henry, welcome to The Big Three. I was wondering if you could start by telling us a little bit more about some of your work at CSIS before we get started.
Sure thing. Thanks so much for having me on. So my name's Henry Ziemer. I'm with the CSIS Americas program. So we cover the Western Hemisphere, Canada to Argentina, and sometimes even to Antarctica when the mood hits. And at the Americas program, my focus is on sort of three priority areas. U.S.-China competition, which we'll probably be talking about at length today, as well as organized crime and public safety in the Americas, which often, actually overlaps a little bit more than you would expect, as I'm sure we'll get in, as I'm sure we'll get into on this podcast. And then I also cover critical minerals with the Americas program. So happy to delve into all of those things because really they all come together at the port, which is kind of this nexus for all these various issues.
Perfect. Yeah. So let's get started. I mean, I think the first topic that we wanted to get into was the framing of the network effect that you talked about in your testimony. So maybe if you could start there, walk us through the network effect framing and why do these investments that China's making have to be read as a portfolio? And what does Washington miss by treating them as one-off deals?
Yeah, that's a great place to start. I think it was Sir Walter Raleigh who said, whosoever controls the seas controls the trade, whosoever controls the trade controls the riches of the world, and then consequently the world itself. My sense of China's maritime strategy is that they're kind of playing around with that order. They're trying to control the trade and then through that kind of gain a backdoor to controlling the seas. And they're doing that through this networked offensive where they're not just seeking to invest in ports, but they're also dominating global shipbuilding, global shipping lines. You see agencies like COSCO, for instance, that are, a shipping company, but now getting into the ports business with Chancay. And then, of course, controlling not only, the physical infrastructure that you think about when you think about ports, the cranes, the scanners, but also the digital infrastructure, the logistics management software, and all the various technical details that go into ports as a means of expanding their maritime influence. And this is quite difficult, actually. When you think about it. To measure. So me and my team at CSIS, we set out to try and map and to provide the most comprehensive map of China's port influence in Latin America and the Caribbean. We ended up, as you noted in the intro, finding 37 different active or in some cases canceled or inactive port projects throughout the Western Hemisphere. This is, about twice as many as any previous study had identified. And then we did, we tried to go a layer deeper, which is we tried to assess the risk of any given one of these port projects. So we looked at 11 different sub-indicators grouped across sort of two pillars, looking at both how much does the United States rely on a particular port project for trade, as well as, for potential security or military contingencies? And then how much influence does China have over that port? Is China just building the port, or are they, actually embedded in the operating system? Are they a minority stakeholder, majority stakeholder? What level of control does China really exercise? And so that allowed us to actually assign a score, a numerical score, from 0 to 100 for every port in our database, and see, where should we really be focused on. But I'll say, even that effort fails sometimes to capture this network effect that we're talking about, which is the fact that, the utility of a port grows dramatically the more ports and the more shipping, you control. If you think about it, like in the case of the Panama Canal, for instance, most of these ports are transshipment ports. It means that, they're not actually servicing always the ships that are going through the canal, but rather ships come, they dock, they offload, and then those same, those containers that one ship offloads are loaded onto another ship that ultimately transits through the canal. If you control other kind of nodes in that supply chain, you can know who's sending what from where to where, and really unlock a lot of efficiencies, and competitive advantages, and in my opinion, in the case of China, strategic advantages when you have that kind of vertically integrated supply chain.
And I think that Chancay is one of the best examples of this phenomenon that you're talking about. And it's not just that China acquired this port in Peru; they built it from scratch from this small town, and it's also all the it's all the infrastructure that goes alongside this port as well. And I wanted you to talk a little bit about what sort of influence this unlocks over a lot of these countries, because they're not only investing all this money in the port, but they're investing in the operations, they're investing in the infrastructure behind it. And what kind of leverage does that unlock over these countries, and how much of a gateway is it into Chinese control in the region?
Yeah, so I think for the longest time, when people talked about China's port investments, they talked about the port of Hambantota in Singapore. Excuse me, they talked about the port of Hambantota in Sri Lanka, where, of course, was this archetypical example of debt trap diplomacy, where Sri Lanka's inability to pay back the loan led to China actually seizing the physical port. Today, I don't think that's the model. Instead, I think it looks a lot more like Chancay. And let me just kind of walk a little bit through the story of how this port came to be and some of the controversy around it. So, China's Peru's number one trading partner. They buy tons of copper and other goods, raw materials typically from Peru. Peru's been looking to modernize its port infrastructure for a long time. They've been looking to expand out from Callao, which is in Lima, which is sort of hemmed in by geography. And so, of course, the opportunity to build this brand new megaport a little bit north of Lima was a great opportunity. They signed an MOU with COSCO in 2021, and construction begins. China moves quite quickly into, as we all know, China does. But then in 2024, in the spring of 2024, the year that it's set to be inaugurated, year, as you mentioned, when Xi Jinping is scheduled to come in November and open the port, just a few months before, Peru cites an administrative error and says that actually the contract that they signed with COSCO in 2021 violates Peruvian law because it gives COSCO exclusive control over that port to operate, and that's illegal in Peru. You need to have a Peruvian partner that has some stake in that port. And what China decides to do in response is, first of all, they threaten arbitration, but second of all, they threaten to simply pull out of the port and leave Peru with a half-built port and its sort of dreams of a new gateway to Asia deferred. And what does Peru decide to do in response? They change their law. They allow a private company to have sort of a 30-year lease of a period of exclusivity in order for Chancay basically to set up and finish operations. And now, we if you look at kind of just about a year or a couple of years onwards, we see that influence hasn't even diminished. So in February, a Peruvian court ruled that Ocitran, Peru's sort of state transit regulator, can't actually oversee operations at Chancay because it's a private port, but with private capital. So there's actually, even less transparency into the port today. And then I'll finally note that we talk about Chancay as a megaport, but it just concluded its first year of operations, of formal operations as a port, and it reported about 500,000 20-foot equivalent units, the sort of standard measure of containerized shipping. That's about a fifth of what Balboa in Panama moved last year, maybe a sixth. By no means is it this colossus of shipping that people often make it out to be. It of course has potential, and we should definitely wait. But the current kind of capacity at Chancay hovers between 1 million and 1.5 million 20-foot equivalent units of throughput. There are plans to expand that out to a potential future amount of 3 million, which would genuinely be a mega port at that stage. But that's contingent on China continuing to invest in this port. So COSCO has actually bought really durable influence in Peru. If you think about it, it's not just that they open the port and all of a sudden this issue goes away. Peru still needs a continued influx of capital and investment if it really wants to kind of realize the dream of Chancay.
And just to take a step back here for a second, can you explain a little bit what COSCO is and why it is so important? Because I'm sure most Americans haven't heard of it, and when they do hear it, they think of course, like the superstore in America. So what exactly is COSCO and why are they so important? Because now they're not only just the shipping company, they're directly involved in the running of a lot of these ports.
Sure, yeah. So COSCO, often referred as the China Ocean Shipping Company. I swear, I've had to explain to my parents a number of times that no, it's not the big box store that's building a port in Peru. It is a Chinese state-owned shipping company. They're notable for being one of the largest shipping companies in the world, leveraging China's dominance in shipbuilding. Right, China builds the vast majority of container, of global container ships, and so kind of building off of these network effects, honestly, or synergies, they've been able to dominate global shipping, and now they're moving into ports. And so Chancay, as you rightly point out, is sort of the first instance of a kind of tip to tail integrated process where COSCO not only helps to build the port alongside some other Chinese SOEs, state-owned enterprises, some of which have ties to the People's Liberation Army and the Chinese military as well. So they help to build it, but now they're operating it exclusively. And I'll note, and I'm sure we'll get into this a little bit later in the podcast, this is definitely not COSCO's last project. They are actively looking to expand their footprint in regional ports, including with the sale of some of 43 CK Hutchison ports that was initially meant to go to BlackRock and a Swiss-Italian conglomerate, the Mediterranean Shipping Company. COSCO is trying to get a stake there. They're also trying to expand their operations in Brazil with the upcoming concession at the Port of Santos. So COSCO is definitely kind of making a full court press to break into the port space.
So real quick before we pivot over to the second segment, I wanted to ask a follow-up just because, for folks listening at home, maybe this becomes a little abstract. And so some folks might even say, oh, like, what's the big deal if, China's investing in ports? Like, so what? They're maybe just shipping their cargo here and there. But, you touched a little bit on the military civil fusion and the whole nexus between, these aren't just commercial. They don't necessarily serve commercial purposes. They could also serve a military advantage. Maybe if you could speak just a little bit about that and why folks should take note of this issue, why it's something that to be thinking about.
Yeah,
the Chancay
that's a great
port,
question.
Yeah.
I'll kind of talk broadly because this is something that we dwelt on a lot as we were building this risk index is, what is really risk when it comes down to the port space. And I think a lot of people a lot of the common analyses focus on Chinese overseas ports as sort of a precursor to military bases. And in Latin America and the Caribbean, I don't think that's the case. I don't think that we're going to see Chancay be converted into a Chinese overseas naval base. That's not really the risk I'm looking at. Maybe, and in which case that will be alarm bells blaring in my head. But I'm even more kind of interested in what we were talking about, the complexity of global supply chains, and the network effect and that control that gives you. So we saw during the COVID-19 pandemic how, global supply chains are fragile. And, even a momentary delay in certain critical inputs can result in significant downstream effects. So one of the key risk factors we looked at was U.S. reliance on a particular port. And if you think about, why in our database a lot of Mexican ports actually scored higher, it's because they're trading a tremendous amount with the United States. So if you think about, let's say, in the event of a future crisis or a conflict scenario where the United States is trying to get critical inputs, magnets, machine tools, critical minerals shipped in to bolster its, domestic defense industrial base, or to respond, get personal protective equipment to respond to a crisis at home. And all of a sudden those shipments get delayed, or they get stopped at the port, or there's an accident with one of the ship-to-shore cranes that, by the way, China controls 70 to 80% of the market for. All of a sudden, you can start to see some cascading effects. And those effects are magnified when you think about this network of 37 ports, or this network of ports and shipping companies. So, think about like the one little inconvenience in your day-to-day life that's downstream of a supply chain, and just magnify that by the sheer volume of control over the maritime shipping sector that China has. And I think to me, that's what's really concerning. Another just kind of brief thing I'll point or highlight is we saw how sophisticated kind of sabotage and threats, I think, to the homeland are becoming. We've seen in Ukraine from operations like Operation Spider's Web that disabled a significant portion of Russian command and control aircraft with a drone attack. Well, ports are really convenient places to kind of secret away the potential military equipment for even attacks on the homeland, or attacks on U.S. naval vessels that are docking in ports to conduct resupply missions. So that's something that does keep me up at night. I think it's I think it's more remote than some of the doom and gloom prognostications make it out to be. But I do think it's always worth highlighting that there is real sabotage risk. There is real military and operational security risks that go along with ports. And again, they're multiplied many times over the more ports and the more nodes of this logistical chain you give the PRC control over.
Yeah, that's really helpful. And I guess, so to pivot over to the second topic, I think, so we've talked about the ports strategy, the network effect therein, but you actually go a little deeper in your testimony, and you talk about the infrastructure as well, because it's not just about securing access to the ports and ownership of the ports. It's also they're supplying the cranes and the scanners. There's energy transmission, like all of these infrastructure components, but then there's a cybersecurity layer that runs through all of that. So, they can collect collect intelligence through commercial infrastructure and things like that. So maybe why don't you talk us through what that looks like, and what might be the worst case scenario in a crisis? I think you touched a little bit about that, but if you could expound on that.
Yeah. So we focused in our database on sort of two types of potentially dangerous or disruptive technology. And those were ZPMC cranes and Nuktek scanners. And so ZPMC is a Chinese ship-to-shore crane manufacturer. They supply, as I mentioned, their market share is about 70 to 80% of all ship-to-shore cranes in the world. They're prevalent, and I've been to ports. They're everywhere at these ports, and including in U.S. ports. And so part of our rationale for including this was a report by the U.S. Select Committee on the CCP, which found that in U.S. ports, ZPMC or a party contracted with them had installed cellular modems onto ship-to-shore cranes in U.S. ports, and had repeatedly requested remote access to its ship-to-shore cranes in U.S. ports. So right, these are risks that are well documented kind of in the homeland here in the United States. But you better believe that in the Americas, these risks are also present, and may even be more potent, because in a country that may not have kind of the robust critical infrastructure kind of protection mentality the U.S. has, that might just be like, oh, of course, they're requesting access. we'll give you access. There's no sort of step two or follow up there. So ZPMC cranes are particularly concerning because of how prevalent they are, because of the documented cybersecurity and infrastructure risks. Nuktek scanners. Nuktek is a growing supplier of scanners, both for the thing you walk through at the airport, the X-ray machine you put your luggage through, but also cargo scanners. And this is a real priority in Latin America, where of course we're confronting a burgeoning drug trade, much of it which goes through the ports. So countries are looking to shore up their port security by purchasing scanners, and China has kind of leveraged that to make a play to sell its own scanner technology. Now, the risk you run with this is oftentimes, the very things that are appealing to a port operator from a security perspective are a risk from kind of a national security perspective. So from a civil security perspective versus a national security perspective. And one example I'll give is I was speaking to someone down in Panama who said that Nuktek, kind of one of their selling points, they say our system can integrate with local law enforcement databases. So, you've got a driver who's going to pick up a container at the port, and there's a scanner that reads the driver's biometrics, makes sure that they're associated with the truck that they're driving, cross-references that with the port authority, but also then goes and cross-references it with local law enforcement databases to see, have they been arrested for a drunk driving incident? Do they have any, criminal convictions on their record? Is their license, working? Well, that's good, and I think it's worthwhile if you're a port operator. You want to know that information, but it also means that all of a sudden you're giving a Chinese company access into your law enforcement system. And the PRC, by the way, has a national security law that requires even private companies to collaborate and share information with the CCP when it has a national, kind of a nebulous national security nexus. So you see kind of how there's a tension at play, I would say, between China providing these services that port operators might want at a low cost, but also opening that up to greater cyber vulnerabilities. And the last thing I'll touch on, which was not in the database because it's really actually hard to find good data on, but is port management services. And there's been a lot of, coverage of what, China calls lodging, which is their integrated kind of port data management that allows you to see, all the records of where shipments are coming from, where they're going to, final destinations, that China's piloted in their own ports, and is reportedly trying to push in the ports where it has influence. And that's, again, super concerning to me from a national defense security perspective, because the more data you have access to, the more data you, in this case China, has access to, the easier they can find, what are those critical nodes that if something went wrong here, it would have a cascading effect downstream on supply chain security and U.S. economic security. And by, pushing out lodging to various port operators, it just gives them so much more visibility into the kind of the lifeblood of global commerce.
Yeah, and I wanted to expand on that as well, just to really show how deep this Chinese influence really goes. And beyond all the issues you just talked about, we also have seen how Chinese state-owned firms control 100% of the electrical transmission into Lima, more than half the distribution in Chile, 12% in Brazil. And then on the commodity side, they also have significant stakes in Brazilian oil terminals, in grain terminals in Brazil. And then they're even building a new port to export copper from Peru. And so where does this really put China as far as leverage and influence wise? I think you've compared this to the power that U.S. financial sanctions have, which has really been the gold standard of being able to project this economic influence around the world. And so where does China currently stand with that influence, not only over a lot of these Latin American countries, but especially when we're looking at these critical commodities, how does that also get leverage over the U.S., especially for the critical minerals that they've had so many restrictions on, being able to take a lot of those from South America and hold that over the U.S. and these Latin American countries as well?
Yeah, thank you for asking that, because this is sort of a theory that I've been playing around with, which is China sees the U.S. financial sanctions sort of architecture that's been incredibly successful. They see, how we've also added tariffs to that architecture to achieve kind of geoeconomic ends. And China knows that they can't quite replicate that, right? They're trying to supplant the dollar in global financial markets, but that's slow going. And instead, what I think China is trying to drive at places like Latin America and the Caribbean is what I call kind of a physical sanctions network, where they control sufficient, physical infrastructure in these countries that it gives them leverage tantamount to or equivalent to potentially, what a U.S. fighting, full court press economic sanctions effort might be. What I think in particular, what's caused me to start thinking about this, start worrying about this more, is we've seen the U.S. undergo a historic pivot to the Americas, where for decades, kind of, I like to say there was a formula for writing a story about China and Latin America, which was, you said China's doing something, the United States is absent, and the United States should care more, and you kind of were shouting from the rooftops. That's changed. Now the U.S. is actually going on the offensive in places like Panama, where China's lost control, in places like Chile, where the United States put a lot of pressure on the incoming COSCO government to scuttle a proposed subsea cable project. In places like Peru, where we're still also applying pressure, over the port of Chancay and broader Chinese influence. And so, when I sit back and I think, okay, if the U.S. is finally rolling up its sleeves, and starting to pressure Chinese projects in the Americas, what does China have to fall back on? And what they really have to fall back on in most cases is infrastructure. It's the fact that 100%, like you said, of Lima's power generation, a city of 11 million people, roughly a third of Peru's population, is dependent on 2 Chinese electrical utilities. It's the fact that, in many of these countries, their telecommunications networks were built by and are maintained by Huawei. It's the fact that, again, and if you look at places like Peru, they're still dependent on further, subsequent Chinese investment to realize the economic gains that have been promised, or in places like Ecuador, which recently just signed an agreement with Power China to maintain the Coca-Cola Sinclair Dam, a dam that, by the way, has been, a massive boondoggle from an infrastructure standpoint, but sort of China is the only one who can maintain it and who can keep it running and keep it from, maybe potential catastrophic collapse. So the physical infrastructure investments, physical and digital, I guess I would say, give China real durable influence in the Western Hemisphere, and it's something that I think from a U.S. perspective is going to be really hard to extirpate.
Yeah, so I think we can probably turn to the third segment at this point, where I guess we'll call it tactical victory and strategic defeat. So there's a test case playing out right now. So last year, CK Hutchinson agreed to sell its 43 overseas ports, including the ports flanking the Panama Canal, to BlackRock-led U.S. consortium, and then Beijing pushed back, and COSCO entered the picture. And you framed what's happened since as a possible tactical victory and yet a strategic defeat for the U.S. And so if you could talk us through a little bit about what's still at risk, why do you frame it that way? If that's a strategic defeat or, rather than the clean win that the administration is calling it.
Yeah, no, of course. So right. I think around March of 2025, there was this announcement that CK Hutchinson was selling 43, all of its overseas ports, all of its ports not in Hong Kong or China, to a consortium helmed by BlackRock, and then the Swiss-Italian conglomerate Mediterranean Shipping Company. And I think, quite frankly, that this was a coup for the United States. It was a model as well that I'll maybe get into a little bit later when we talk about future solutions options. But it was a model of using kind of high-level political pressure, whether you agreed with that or not, on Panama, to create the conditions, and then leveraging U.S. kind of capital markets, the best in the world, along with a trusted partner from a like-minded democratic country and context, to, in one fell swoop, drastically reduce China's influence in overseas ports. In the aftermath of that, I think China kind of tipped its hand, right? You could either these ports were purely commercial assets, which China had no strategic interest in whatsoever, in which case you let the deal go through, right? You don't care about, or they're not. And China kind of showed that it was the latter, because they said that, we will not allow this deal to move forward if it prejudices China's strategic interests, right? They put out, several op-eds attacking Li Ka-shing, the chairman of CK Hutchinson, for failing to be patriotic, and for basically selling out the national interest for a quick buck. So China tipped its hand that it cared a lot more about these ports that it maybe wanted to let on, and then it succeeded, honestly, in scuttling the initial deal. The period of exclusivity for BlackRock and MSC to negotiate with Hutchison lapsed in July, after which new parties could enter the deal. We saw that COSCO, right, the like very same, not the big box store, but the Chancay port operator, trying to enter that with some, Bloomberg reporter who was asking for basically veto rights, which were left somewhat nebulous. But broadly, I think would be, if I'm China, I'm thinking, no selling this, bare minimum, no selling this to anyone without our say so. Anyone new. So Costco tries to enter the deal. At the same time, Panama, kind of announces this lawsuit about the port concessions, the two port concessions along the Canal Balboa and Cristobal, and that begins to move through as this deal is being negotiated. And then in January, we see the Panamanian Supreme Court announce its decision that the concessions were unconstitutional. And I'll do kind of a slight tangent here just to note that while we talk about this kind of from a geopolitical standpoint, from a U.S.-China competition standpoint, in Panama, right, the story is of corruption and of sovereignty, right? The Panamanian Supreme Court didn't rule that the United States was good and China was bad, right? They ruled that the concessions were unconstitutional because they violated principles of, benefit for the public, of equitable treatment and profit sharing and revenue sharing from, the port operators, and they gave them too much control over these facilities. So, like, I do want to kind of raise that as maybe the narrative, I think, that often gets forgotten in these conversations where we're talking about U.S.-China competition, that there is there's an angle there and there's a perspective there from the local population or from impacted countries that we should also be paying attention to. But that decision comes along, and I think everyone kind of declares victory. But we should remember again that there's 43 ports on the table. So subtract 2, there's still 41 ports that Hutchison operates that are up for grabs, including 5 in Latin America and the Caribbean, including 4 in Mexico. And 2 of which are in our top 3 riskiest ports from a U.S. perspective. One that's also in the Bahamas, and let me tell you, if you care about threats to the U.S. homeland, the Bahamas is basically our third border from a maritime perspective, certainly. And it seems like that issue is not going anywhere. The last reporting I saw from April said that not only was COSCO kind of interested in it, but China Merchants Port, another Chinese state-owned port company, is also trying to get in on this deal. Meanwhile, Hutchison has announced major investments last November in its port of Lázaro Cárdenas in Mexico. That's not something you would do if you're trying to kind of offload these facilities. So it seems like we're at a real risk of, I guess, in base case scenario, the deal just falls through and Hutchison retains its investment and influence, in which case our risk scores are unchanged. These ports are still very risky, some of the riskiest actually in the Western Hemisphere from a U.S. perspective. Or, worst case scenario, a Chinese SOE gains a stake. And by the way, we reran the risk calculations with even a minority stake for COSCO. They would be probably the same for China merchants. And the risk scores for all Hutchison ports go up with that, even in a minority kind of shareholding pattern where there's another stakeholder that has a majority stake, but China still exercises, these kind of veto rights from its position.
And just as a quick follow-up to that point, because I think you made a really interesting point about Panama and why their decision wasn't really picking the U.S. over China in any sort of just U.S. is better sense, but it was a corruption issue, and they valued that. But more often than not, as we've seen, these Latin American countries are choosing China. They are allowing a lot of this investment in. So I wonder if you could just quickly summarize why China has been basically winning this battle. Why is this Chinese investment been such an enticing offer for a lot of these Latin American countries? Because we've talked a lot about the control that China can influence over them, how with 100% of the electrical transmission in Lima, how this has all this potentially sanctions level control. But why are the Latin American countries allowing this to happen in the first place? What is the big carrot that China's offering that a lot of the U.S. Policies have not been as enticing for?
Sure, right. I think that it basically comes down to speed and need. Right? China can build things quickly and they can build the things these countries need. And in a base case scenario, right, like we saw in Chancay, Peru would rather have a port that, even one that China actually has influence, undue influence over, even one that's driven up, crime and extortion in the neighboring town, they'd rather have that port than not have that port, right? And what China can offer is they can fill that need that these countries have, and they can fill it quickly. And one thing we should also note that I have talked to many people in the region about is that Chinese infrastructure projects are not, they're risky. There are definitely horror stories, but they're not shoddy. And these days, China has, there's a reason that China dominates kind of global shipbuilding, or they dominate ship-to-shore cranes, or they dominate in 5G. It's because they are providing a genuinely competitive service, and they're providing it at a cost, kind of finicky or gray zone financing aside, they're providing it at a cost that for many Latin American leaders, they can afford. And then the last thing I'll note is, of course, right, the Americas, one of our great strengths is that we are a region of democracies. We are a region, that actually the Inter-American Democratic Charter says that democracy is the only form of government acceptable to the people of the Americas. That also means that we're subject to the same, election cycles that we know and love here in the United States. And there's a pressure on leaders who are up for re-election or are trying to expand their power base to show results quickly. And so if China comes along and says, look, we can build you a dam, we can build you a port, we can build you a road, interconnection within your term, countries are going to go with that rather than, a more transparent, potentially financing process that takes time and is slower.
And to wrap things up, I wanted to shift a little bit to the supply side and really kind of highlight a potential area where a lot of the diagnosis that you have could run into a potential problem. For example, your main policy recommendations for DFC port buybacks, U.S. Navy avoiding PRC-influenced ports, Army Corps of Engineers building LAC port infrastructure, CFIUS-style screening, all of these, I agree with you. I think that these are all really great solutions, but the one big worry that I have is really on the U.S. capacity side for shipbuilding. Because in the past couple decades, China went from about 5% of global shipbuilding in the year 2000 to more than 50% today. And meanwhile, U.S. yards are producing fewer than 5 ocean-going vessels per year. Meanwhile, China has about 1,700. And so if the U.S. really wants to have this credible alternative to China in the region, especially with ports, especially with a lot of this maritime infrastructure, where do we have to begin to really rebuild this shipbuilding capacity in the U.S., and how important is that as part of the policy solution?
Yeah, I think there's no way around the need to reindustrialize. The fact of the matter is, right, China can build these things because they have the capacity. And if we don't have that capacity, there's no world in which we're going to be able to outcompete. I will note that, I think that there are real sources of strength still in the United States. We do have globally competitive infrastructure companies. We have companies like Bechtel that can, that can build impressive projects and have bid and in some cases lost out to Chinese infrastructure investments in Latin America. So we do have, that muscle memory and that backbone, but we need to rebuild it. And I think, that is going to take some time, and it's going to take kind of a hard look at our domestic economy. That's not really, what I focus on here at CSIS. But what I often say is the other thing we need to be doing is we need to be looking around for allies and partners. And so I mentioned before the BlackRock deal, the Hutchison BlackRock deal as being kind of this archetypical investment where, you have a top-down U.S. political signal. You bring in U.S. capital markets, which are pretty good at allocating resources, right? Pretty good at allocating capital, and then you partner with a like-minded ally or a company with a like-minded ally, of which there's actually a lot in the port and maritime space, right? We've got Maersk, we've got MSC, we've got Port Singapore Authority, we've got Evergreen in Taiwan. We have friends who have expertise in maritime shipping, port management issues, and we bring them in. And sort of that's where I would say, the U.S. should look to start, right, in the interest of kind of like staunching the bleeding, maybe, or starting to compete better. But long term, right, there's no way out of reindustrialization, in my opinion.
Yeah, so I think selfishly, Andrew and we could probably carry this conversation on even longer than we have, but I know we want to be respectful of your time. So I guess before we let you go, Henry, like what's the one thing maybe you'd like our listeners to take away from either the work you've done or our podcast today?
Yeah. Oh boy. Yeah, now all of a sudden I'm at a loss for words. But I think the one thing I always return to is just 80% of global trade moves by sea. Ports are, but people don't live in the ocean, right? Ports are the interface through which so much of the global economy flows. And when they're run well and they're run effectively, they're a boon to both the communities, the local communities, and for the world. And I think that's why I care so much. I guess I would leave it just saying ports matter. Paying attention to ports and not just at a strategic level, but the nitty gritty of how are we modernizing, how are we digitizing, how are we implementing AI and automation into these facilities, and how are we doing that securely in a way that ensures that we're resilient and hardened against threats. Is incredibly important. It's only growing more important. So I'm grateful to see, more interest in what I think a few years ago was probably a pretty wonky subject. And I'm excited to keep for it to keep going, and hopefully keep evolving in a positive direction.
Great. And for the folks at home, I did not tell Henry I was going to be asking that question, so he was very quick on his feet and gave us a fantastic answer. Thank you so much. Henry Ziemer of CSIS, thank you so much for joining the Big Three. China's port strategy in Latin America covers a portfolio of infrastructure that moves the physical economy, the ports, the cranes, the scanners, the rail corridors, etc. The U.S. response has to be physical, too, financing shipbuilding equipment and an affirmative offer to partner countries. Otherwise, the warnings fall on deaf ears. So learn more about our work at theprosperousamerica.org, and be sure to find us on YouTube, and you can check out the Big Three on Apple, Spotify, Google, or wherever you get your podcast. Thank you again, Henry.
Thanks for having me on.